The great dining hall of the Dravik pack buzzed with the familiar symphony of hierarchy. Laughter that rang sharp from the high tables where the Alpha-born sat in their inherited glory. Murmured conversations from the middle ranks discussing training schedules and territorial patrols, and the careful silence from the lower tables where Omegas ate quickly and kept their eyes down. Ilara Voss had perfected the art of invisibility, sitting alone at the far corner of the Omega section in a placement so marginal it might as well have been exile. She possessed what the pack considered the worst possible combination of traits: scentless, wolfless, and utterly unremarkable in appearance. The pack tolerated her presence because her parents had died in service to the Alpha King, but tolerance was a far cry from acceptance, and acceptance was something Ilara had stopped hoping for years ago. She preferred invisibility. It meant safety, and safety meant survival. That's when she heard the confident, predatory footsteps that stopped beside her table, followed by a voice that belonged to Ronan Dravik, son of the Lycan king, and the last person who should ever have reason to speak to her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked with casual authority, his amber eyes holding depth she couldn't fathom as every conversation in the dining hall ceased completely. This was wrong. Alpha-born royalty didn't seek out the company of Omega nobodies, much less in front of the entire pack. But saying no to the heir wasn't an option that existed for someone in her position. As he settled into the chair across from her, their conversation began like a trap she couldn't see, his questions probing her understanding of pack hierarchy and her place within it. When she honestly described her value as staying invisible and not causing problems, something flickered in his expression that looked almost like curiosity, as if he saw something in her that she'd never recognized in herself. The moment shattered when Lydia Vance, Ronan's intended mate, approached with polite authority and dismissive assessment of Ilara's worth. But instead of taking the graceful exit offered, Ronan defended Ilara's intelligence and refused to leave, creating unprecedented tension that stretched through the dining hall like a wire about to snap. Then, without warning, something shifted in the air around their table, something electric and dangerous that made Ilara's skin prickle with awareness. For the first time in her life, she caught a scent that wasn't her own, wild and woodsy and powerfully masculine, while Ronan stared at her with an expression of shock so profound it looked like pain. The sound he made was somewhere between a growl and a gasp, before he suddenly fled the hall, leaving Ilara surrounded by burning questions and the terrifying certainty that something had just changed everything. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. Ilara barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself reliving those final moments in the dining hall, the way the air had shifted around their table, the wild scent that had somehow emerged from nowhere, and most disturbing of all, the expression of shock and recognition that had crossed Ronan's face before he'd fled like something was chasing him. She'd spent the night staring at her ceiling, trying to understand what had happened, and dreading the consequences that were sure to follow. By morning, those consequences had already begun. The first sign came when she entered the communal Omega quarters, to find every conversation stop the moment she appeared. Eyes that had never bothered to notice her before now tracked her every movement with uncomfortable intensity. Whispers followed in her wake, not the casual gossip that usually filled the space, but sharp, speculative murmurs that made her skin crawl with awareness that she'd become the center of attention she'd spent years avoiding. "There she is," someone said, not quite quietly enough to escape her hearing. "The one who made the prince run. I heard his wolf actually responded to her," another voice added. "First time anyone's seen him react that way to anyone. Impossible. She doesn't even have a scent." Maybe that's changing. Ilara kept her head down and moved through the quarters as quickly as possible, gathering her work assignment for the day from the duty board near the entrance. Kitchen detail, as usual. The kind of solitary task that kept her away from the training grounds and pack meetings where her presence might cause disruption. She'd always been grateful for assignments that allowed her to work alone, but today, the isolation felt more like exile than preference. The pack kitchens were located in the lower levels of the stronghold, carved from living rock, and equipped with the kind of industrial facilities necessary to feed a population of 3,000 wolves. Ilara had worked there for nearly 5 years, long enough to know every corner of the massive space, and to perfect the art of preparing meals without attracting notice from the senior staff. She was halfway through her morning prep work, when footsteps echoed from the main corridor, not the quick, efficient steps of kitchen workers, but the measured pace of someone with authority who expected others to make way for their passage. Ilara didn't look up from the vegetables she was chopping, hoping that whoever was approaching would pass by without noticing her presence. The footsteps stopped directly behind her. Ilara Voss. The voice made her freeze, knife suspended halfway through a carrot, as recognition sent ice through her veins. She knew that voice, deep, commanding, and carrying the kind of absolute authority that could reshape lives with a single word. Alpha King Matthias Dravik stood behind her, and there was nowhere to run. Slowly, Ilara set down her knife and turned to face the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories. Matthias was an older, more intimidating version of his son, taller, broader, with silver threading through dark hair and scars that mapped decades of brutal victories. His amber eyes held depths that seemed to strip away every defense she'd thought she possessed, and his presence filled the kitchen with the kind of dangerous potential that made her wolf instincts scream warnings she couldn't heed. "Your Majesty," she managed, dropping into the deepest bow her position allowed. "How may I serve you?" "You can start by explaining what happened in the dining hall last night." The question hit like a physical blow, stealing what little composure she'd managed to maintain. "I don't understand, Your Majesty. Nothing happened." "Nothing?" Matthias moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame. "My heir, who has never shown interest in anyone outside his intended political alliance, spent an hour having public conversation with an Omega nobody, then fled the hall as if something had set his wolf on fire. And you call that nothing?" "I don't know why he chose to sit with me," Ilara said honestly, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. "He asked if he could join me, and I couldn't refuse. We talked about pack structure, and my role within it. Then he left. That's all I can tell you. Look at me." The command carried weight that made her body respond before her mind could object. Ilara lifted her gaze to meet amber eyes that seemed to see far more than surface appearances. "Better," Matthias said after a moment of uncomfortable scrutiny. "Now tell me what you are." "I'm Omega-born, scentless, wolfless, the daughter of pack members who died in your service, granted membership through bloodline protection." The words emerged automatically, the same description she'd given countless times when her status needed clarification. "That's what you've been told you are," Matthias corrected. "I'm asking what you actually are." The distinction sent confusion spiraling through her thoughts. "I don't understand the difference. Don't you?" His eyes narrowed with sharp interest. "Last night, my son's wolf responded to your presence for the first time in his life. Wolves don't respond to nothing, Ilara. They respond to power, to compatibility, to bonds that run deeper than conscious recognition. That's impossible." "I don't have a wolf. I can't shift. I don't have a scent." "You had a scent last night." The interruption was quiet, but carried absolute certainty. "A scent that called to something in my son's blood, with enough force to send him running from a room he's never retreated from before." The words hit like revelation and terror combined. Ilara's hands began to shake as she tried to process what he was suggesting, that something about her had changed, that the invisibility she'd counted on for survival might be dissolving in ways she couldn't control. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. "I've been the same my entire life. Nothing about me has changed. Perhaps not consciously. But bodies don't lie, and wolves don't respond to incompatibility." Matthias stepped back slightly, though his attention remained fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. "Tell me, have you experienced any unusual sensations recently? Dreams that felt more real than sleep should allow? Physical responses that surprised you with their intensity?" Heat flooded Ilara's cheeks as she remembered the wild scent that had somehow emerged from nowhere during her conversation with Ronan, the way her skin had prickled with awareness she couldn't name. But admitting to such experiences felt like confessing to something she didn't understand and couldn't control. "I've been having some different dreams," she said carefully, "but nothing that seemed significant." "Dreams of what?" "Running, being free, having a wolf of my own." The words emerged before she could stop them, carrying longing she'd thought she'd buried years ago. "But they're just dreams. Wishful thinking from someone who spent her life watching others shift while remaining stubbornly human." "Show me your hands." The request caught her off guard. "Your Majesty? Your hands. Show them to me." Ilara extended her hands palm up, confused about what he expected to find. Her hands looked exactly as they always had. Small, calloused from kitchen work, unremarkable in every way. Matthias studied them with the intensity of someone reading a complex text. After a moment, he grasped her left wrist gently, turning her hand to examine her palm in better light. "There," he said quietly, tracing something with his fingertip that made her skin tingle with unexpected awareness. "Do you see?" Alara looked where he was pointing and felt her breath catch. Faint lines were visible across her palm, not the normal creases of human skin, but darker marks that seemed to form patterns she'd never noticed before. "What are they?" she asked. "Wolf marks, the signs that appear when a dormant wolf begins to awaken." His amber eyes met hers with intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Alara, I don't think you're wolfless. I think you're a late bloomer whose abilities have been suppressed by trauma or circumstance. That's impossible. I'm 22 years old. If I had a wolf, she would have emerged during adolescence. Under normal circumstances, yes, but extreme trauma can delay emergence, sometimes for years." Matthias released her hand, but continued studying her with the focus of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew. "Tell me about your parents' death." The question opened wounds she'd thought were healed. "They died in a border skirmish when I was 14. Raiders attacked a supply convoy they were guarding. Their bodies were never recovered." "And you witnessed this attack?" "Part of it." The memories came flooding back despite her efforts to keep them buried. "I was traveling with them, helping with supply organization. When the attack started, my mother hid me in a storage compartment and told me not to come out no matter what I heard." "What did you hear?" "Screaming, gunfire, my parents calling for each other across the battlefield." Alara's hands began to shake as the memories took hold. Then silence that lasted forever. When the rescue party finally arrived, they found me still hiding in that compartment. But my parents were gone. "How long were you hidden?" 18 hours. Matthias was quiet for a long moment, his expression growing increasingly grim. 18 hours of terror, trapped and helpless while your parents died protecting others. That kind of trauma could easily suppress wolf emergence, especially in someone whose abilities were already developing late. "You really think I have a wolf?" "I think your wolf has been sleeping for 8 years, and something about my son's presence last night began to wake her up." His smile was slight, but carried warmth that seemed to reach something deep inside her chest. Which would explain his reaction. His wolf recognized yours, before either of you understood what was happening. Before Alara could ask what that meant for her future, footsteps echoed from the main corridor again. These were different from Matthias's measured pace, quicker, more urgent, carrying the kind of controlled desperation that suggested someone searching for something they couldn't afford to lose. "Your Majesty." Ronan's voice carried relief and concern in equal measure as he appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I've been looking everywhere for you, and now you've found me," Matthias replied calmly, along with the source of last night's interesting developments. Ronan's gaze shifted to Alara, and she felt that same electric awareness that had made her skin prickle during their dinner conversation. But this time, instead of confusion, his expression held something that looked like recognition mixed with desperate hope. "It's true, isn't it?" he said quietly. "What I felt last night, it wasn't imagination." "What did you feel?" Matthias asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Like I'd been holding my breath my entire life and could suddenly breathe again." Ronan's amber eyes never left Alara's face, like something that had been missing finally clicked into place. "And how do you feel now?" "Like I'm standing at the edge of a cliff, and jumping might be the only way to survive the fall." The poetic description sent heat flooding through Alara's system, making her acutely aware of every detail of Ronan's presence. The way he moved, the way his scent seemed to call to something deep in her blood, the way looking at him made her feel like she was discovering a part of herself she'd never known existed. "Alara," Matthias said, drawing her attention back to the immediate situation. "I want you to report to Dr. Voss this afternoon for a complete medical evaluation. If you do have a dormant wolf, we need to understand her nature and capabilities before she decides to emerge on her own timeline." "And if I don't have a wolf?" she asked. "If this is all just wishful thinking and impossible coincidence, then we'll deal with that reality when we encounter it," Matthias replied. "But I've been reading wolf signs for 40 years, and everything about you suggests abilities that are awakening rather than abilities that never existed." As father and son departed, leaving Alara alone with thoughts that seemed to spiral faster with each passing moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict or control. For 22 years, she'd been nobody special, an Omega outcast tolerated by obligation and ignored by preference. Now, apparently, she might be someone whose very existence could wake sleeping wolves and reshape the bonds that held pack society together. The question was whether those changes would lead to the acceptance she'd always craved, or to dangers she was completely unprepared to face. Either way, invisibility was no longer an option, and that terrified her more than any other possibility she could imagine. Dr. Elena Voss's medical wing occupied an entire floor of the Dravik stronghold, its gleaming white corridors and state-of-the-art equipment creating an atmosphere that felt more like a research facility than a traditional pack infirmary. As Ilara followed a nurse through halls that smelled of antiseptic and something sharper, wolf musk mixed with medical precision, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to undergo tests that would either validate everything the Alpha King had suggested or prove that her entire world had been built on impossible hopes. The examination room she was led to looked like something from a high-end human hospital, complete with advanced imaging equipment and monitoring devices that hummed with quiet efficiency. Dr. Voss herself was a woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent green eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Ilara's nervous entrance. "Ms. Voss," the doctor said with professional warmth, gesturing toward the examination table. "Please, make yourself comfortable. I understand His Majesty has requested a comprehensive evaluation of your potential wolf characteristics. He thinks I might have a dormant wolf that's finally awakening," Ilara said, settling onto the table with movements that felt awkward under such intense medical scrutiny. "Though I have to admit, the idea seems impossible given my complete lack of shifter abilities for the past 22 years. Late emergence isn't as rare as most people believe, Dr. Voss replied, pulling on latex gloves with practiced efficiency, particularly in cases involving significant trauma during adolescence. The mind has remarkable ways of protecting itself, sometimes at the cost of suppressing abilities that feel too dangerous to manifest." As the examination began, Dr. Voss proved to be thorough to the point of being invasive. Blood draws, saliva samples, detailed measurements of bone density and muscle development, neurological tests that involved following lights and responding to sounds at frequencies that made Ilara's teeth ache. But it was the scent analysis that proved most unsettling. "I'm going to need you to breathe deeply while I take readings from various scent glands," Dr. Voss explained, producing a device that looked like a sophisticated metal wand. "The equipment can detect trace pheromones that aren't noticeable to conscious awareness, but might indicate wolf activity at the cellular level." The process was more invasive than Ilara had expected. Dr. Voss used the scanning device at her pulse points, along her hairline, and at the base of her throat where scent glands would normally be most active. Each scan produced readings that appeared on a connected computer screen in patterns that meant nothing to Ilara but seemed to fascinate the doctor. "Interesting," Dr. Voss murmured, studying the results with growing excitement. "Very interesting indeed. What is it?" Ilara asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer. "Your scent signature is remarkably complex for someone who's supposedly scentless." Dr. Voss turned the computer screen so Ilara could see the wave-like patterns displayed across its surface. "These readings show definite pheromone activity, but it's muted somehow, suppressed, as if your body is producing the chemicals, but filtering them before they can be detected by other wolves. Is that possible?" "Theoretically, yes. Extreme psychological trauma can cause the body to develop defense mechanisms that override normal biological functions. If your wolf emergence was traumatically interrupted, your system might have learned to suppress scent production as a survival strategy." The explanation made a disturbing kind of sense. If her parents' death had occurred at the precise moment when her wolf should have been emerging, the psychological association between shifting and mortal danger could have created blocks that persisted for years. "But that's not the most interesting finding," Dr. Voss continued, pulling up additional screens that showed different types of analysis. "Your hormone levels are consistent with someone in pre-emergent state. Elevated cortisol, unusual patterns in growth hormone production, and most telling of all, trace levels of lycanthropic enzymes that only appear when a dormant wolf begins preparing for first manifestation." Lycanthropic enzymes? Specialized proteins that facilitate the transformation process. They're only produced when a wolf is within days or weeks of emergence. Dr. Voss's expression grew more serious. "Ilara, based on these results, I believe your wolf isn't just dormant. She's actively preparing to manifest. The question isn't whether you have shifter abilities, but when they're going to appear and how intense the emergence will be after 8 years of suppression. The news should have been thrilling. After a lifetime of believing she was defective, broken, unable to access the most fundamental aspect of wolf identity, she was being told that her abilities had simply been sleeping. But instead of joy, terror flooded her system as the implications began to sink in. What does that mean for my daily life? She asked. If my wolf is preparing to emerge, what should I expect? Increased physical strength and stamina, heightened sensory awareness, emotional volatility as your human and wolf consciousness begin to integrate. Dr. Voss began packing her equipment with efficient movements. But most significantly, you'll become much more attractive to potential mates as your natural scent develops and strengthens. Attractive to potential mates, Alara repeated, feeling heat flood her cheeks as she remembered Ronan's reaction the night before. Is that what happened with Prince Ronan? Did his wolf recognize mine before I was consciously aware she existed? It's entirely possible. Wolves often sense emerging abilities before the individual experiencing them becomes aware of the changes. Dr. Voss paused in her packing, studying Alara with the intensity of someone considering complex medical implications. Ms. Voss, I need to warn you about something. If your wolf has been suppressed for 8 years and is now preparing for emergence, the process might be intense. Intense how? First shifts are typically challenging even under ideal circumstances, but delayed first shifts, especially those triggered by mate recognition, can be overwhelming to the point of being dangerous. The doctor's expression grew more serious. I'm going to recommend that you remain in the medical wing for observation over the next few days. If your emergence happens suddenly, you'll need immediate medical support. Before Alara could ask what kind of medical support might be required, footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Quick, purposeful steps that seemed to carry urgency and barely controlled energy. Dr. Voss glanced toward the door with an expression of knowing anticipation. That will be Prince Ronan, she said calmly. I believe he's been waiting for the results of your examination with considerable investment in the outcome. The door opened to reveal Ronan looking like he'd been pacing for hours. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, hair messed from running his hands through it, clothes slightly wrinkled, amber eyes bright with the kind of intense focus that suggested he'd been thinking about nothing except the conversation he was about to have. Dr. Voss, he said, his voice carrying controlled urgency. What did you find? I found a young woman whose wolf has been dormant for 8 years and is now preparing for delayed emergence, most likely triggered by recent exposure to her potential mate. The doctor's tone was professionally neutral, but Alara caught the slight smile that suggested she was enjoying the dramatic implications of her findings. Ronan's reaction was immediate and visceral. The controlled desperation in his expression transformed into something that looked like relief, mixed with possessive satisfaction. So it's real. What I felt last night, it wasn't imagination. Not imagination, no. Though I should warn both of you that mate bonds triggered by emergence can be particularly intense and difficult to manage. Dr. Voss gathered her files with efficient movements. I'm recommending medical supervision for the next several days, while we monitor the progression of Ms. Voss's transformation. She'll stay in the medical wing? That would be the safest option. No. The word emerged from Ronan with surprising force. She'll stay in the royal wing, where I can ensure her protection if complications arise. Doctor, Voss raised an eyebrow at the unprecedented suggestion. Your Highness, I'm not certain that's appropriate given the developing nature of your relationship. What's not appropriate is leaving my mate unprotected during her emergence period. Ronan's voice carried the kind of authority that didn't allow for argument. If her wolf has been suppressed for 8 years, she'll need constant monitoring from someone capable of managing whatever emerges. The casual use of the word mate sent shock through Alara's system. Wait, she said, finding her voice despite the way her pulse was racing. Nobody said anything about mates. Dr. Voss said potential mate. That's very different from actual mate, is it? Ronan turned his full attention to her, and she felt that same electric awareness that had made her skin prickle during their dinner conversation. Tell me, Alara, how do you feel when you look at me? The question was direct enough that any evasion would be obvious to everyone present, but admitting to the way her body responded to his presence, the increased heart rate, the heightened awareness, the feeling that something in her chest was trying to reach toward him, felt like confessing to desires that could completely reshape her understanding of herself. "I feel different," she said carefully, "more aware of everything. Like something that's been asleep is starting to wake up. And when I'm not around, like something important is missing." The admission emerged before she could stop it, carrying honesty that made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. But instead of amusement or satisfaction, Ronan's expression grew more serious. "That's exactly how I feel," he said quietly. "Like I've been missing something my entire life and only realized it when you were sitting across from me last night. But we don't know each other. We've had one conversation. How can either of us feel like we're missing someone we barely know?" "Because mate bonds don't depend on conscious familiarity, Doctor," Voss interjected, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had observed such phenomena many times before. "They depend on compatibility at levels that transcend rational understanding. Wolf recognizes wolf, even when the human minds haven't yet processed what that recognition means." "So what happens now?" Alara asked, feeling like she was standing at the edge of a precipice with no clear understanding of what lay at the bottom. "Now we monitor your emergence and help you integrate your human and wolf consciousness safely," Dr. Voss replied. "And we ensure that you have appropriate support during what can be a physically and emotionally overwhelming process." "I'll provide that support," Ronan said, his tone carrying the kind of protective certainty that should have been reassuring, but somehow felt overwhelming instead. "Your Highness," Dr. Voss began carefully, "while your desire to protect your potential mate is understandable, managing emergence requires specialized knowledge that— Then you'll teach me what I need to know." Ronan's voice carried the kind of absolute authority that reminded everyone present exactly who he was and what kind of power backed his decisions. "Alara isn't leaving my sight until her wolf is safely emerged and integrated. Whatever education I need to provide appropriate support, I'll acquire." The possessive certainty in his voice sent both comfort and terror through Alara's system. On one hand, having the protection of the pack's heir, during what sounded like a potentially dangerous process, was more security than she'd ever imagined having. On the other hand, that same protection came with implications she wasn't certain she was ready to accept. "What if my wolf emerges and decides she doesn't want to be mated to anyone?" she asked quietly. "What if this attraction we're feeling is just temporary confusion caused by delayed development? Then we'll deal with that reality when we encounter it," Ronan replied, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't seriously considering that possibility. "But I don't think that's what's going to happen." "How can you be so certain?" "Because my wolf has never responded to anyone the way he responded to you last night, and wolves don't lie about compatibility." His amber eyes met hers with intensity that made her breath catch. "Whatever happens with your emergence, whatever your wolf decides about our potential bond, I'm not walking away from the first real connection I've ever felt." The promise in his voice was both thrilling and terrifying in its implications. Alara had spent her entire life being invisible, unimportant, easily forgotten. Now she was apparently the center of attention from someone whose interest could reshape her entire existence. "I need time to process this," she said finally. "Everything you're telling me, about having a wolf, about mate bonds, about my life completely changing, it's too much to understand all at once." "You'll have time," Ronan assured her, "but you'll have it under protection, in a place where I can ensure your safety if complications arise during your emergence." As arrangements were made for Alara's temporary relocation to guest quarters in the royal wing, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Yesterday she had been nobody special, an Omega outcast tolerated through obligation. Today she was apparently a potential mate to the heir of the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories, carrying abilities that had been hidden for 8 years and were now preparing to transform everything about her identity. The question was whether those transformations would lead to the acceptance and belonging she'd always craved, or to responsibilities and dangers she was completely unprepared to handle. Either way, invisibility was no longer an option. And as she followed Ronan through corridors she'd never been permitted to enter, toward quarters that were more luxurious than anything she'd ever imagined, Alara realized that her simple life of careful anonymity had ended forever. Whether what replaced it would prove to be blessing or catastrophe remained to be seen. The royal wing existed in a different universe from the Omega quarters Alara had called home for the past 8 years. As Ronan led her through corridors lined with artwork that looked ancient and priceless, past windows that offered breathtaking views of the mountain valley, and into a suite of rooms that could have housed 20 people comfortably. She felt the weight of how dramatically her circumstances had shifted in less than 24 hours. "This is yours," Ronan said, gesturing to a sitting room furnished with pieces that looked handcrafted by masters. "The bedroom is through there, private bath, and a balcony that overlooks the Eastern Valley. If you need anything, food, clothing, medical attention, there's a communication panel by the door that connects directly to my quarters." The casual mention of their proximity sent heat flooding through her system. "Your quarters are nearby?" "Next door." His amber eyes met hers with intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Close enough that I can reach you immediately if your emergence begins suddenly, but far enough to give you privacy while you adjust to the changes happening in your body." As if summoned by his words, a wave of sensation swept through her that was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. It started as warmth in her chest, then spread outward until every nerve ending seemed to spark with awareness. Her vision sharpened until she could see individual dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight, and scents became so distinct she could identify the wood polish used on the furniture, the soap Ronan had used that morning, and something deeper, something wild and musky that made her wolf stir restlessly. "It's starting," she gasped, gripping the back of a chair as her legs suddenly felt unsteady. "I can feel something waking up." Ronan was beside her instantly, his hands steady on her shoulders as another wave of sensation crashed through her system. "Breathe," he said quietly, his voice carrying a calm authority that helped anchor her awareness. "Don't fight it. Let your wolf wake naturally." "It feels like everything inside me is changing," she whispered, acutely aware of how solid and warm his hands felt through the fabric of her shirt, "like my body is becoming something I don't recognize." "Because it is. Your wolf consciousness is integrating with your human awareness for the first time." His scent, pine and leather, and something uniquely masculine, seemed to surround her, making her feel safer despite the chaos happening inside her body. "The disorientation is normal. It will pass once the initial integration is complete." But the sensations weren't just disorienting. They were overwhelming in ways that made her hyper-aware of every detail of his presence. The way his hands felt against her skin, the way his breathing seemed to match hers, the way looking at him made something deep in her chest purr with contentment she'd never experienced before. "Ronan," she said, surprised by the breathless quality of her own voice. "Something's happening that doesn't feel normal." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, she found herself moving closer to him, drawn by instincts that bypassed rational thought entirely. Her hands came up to rest against his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat accelerating under her palms, as her wolf responded to his proximity with satisfaction that felt almost territorial. "Mine," she whispered, the word emerging from some part of herself she'd never accessed before. "My wolf says you're mine." The effect on Ronan was immediate and dramatic. His pupils dilated until his amber eyes looked almost black, and a low rumble emerged from his chest that sounded like a growl of pure satisfaction. His hands tightened on her shoulders, pulling her closer until she was pressed against the solid warmth of his body. "Yes," he said, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. "Yours, and you're mine." The claiming should have terrified her. 24 hours ago, she'd been invisible, unimportant, belonging to no one and claimed by nothing except the basic obligations of pack membership. Now she was apparently bound to the heir of the most powerful family in the territory, and her emerging wolf was declaring possession with a certainty that transcended logic. But instead of fear, all she felt was rightness, the bone-deep certainty that this was where she belonged, in the arms of someone whose wolf recognized hers with primitive satisfaction that made every other consideration irrelevant. "This is happening too fast," she said, even as her body refused to pull away from his. "We don't know each other well enough for this kind of connection." "Tell that to our wolves," Ronan replied, his hands moving to frame her face with a gentleness that contrasted with the possessive intensity in his eyes. "Because they seem to think they've known each other forever." Before she could respond, another wave of sensation swept through her, stronger this time, accompanied by physical changes she could actually feel happening. Her hearing sharpened until she could detect conversations happening floors below. Her sense of smell became so acute that she could identify individual scents from throughout the stronghold, and most disturbing of all, she could feel her bones shifting subtly, preparing for transformations she'd never experienced. "It's accelerating," she gasped, gripping Ronan's shirt as her knees buckled with the force of changes happening too quickly for her mind to process. I think my wolf is trying to emerge right now. That's not uncommon with mate-bonded emergency emergence, Ronan said, scooping her into his arms with fluid strength. The presence of a compatible mate can trigger accelerated development. We need to get you somewhere safe where you can shift without injury. He carried her through the sitting room to the bedroom beyond, setting her gently on a bed large enough for 6 people. The room was decorated in warm earth tones that seemed designed to create a sense of safety and comfort, but Alara barely noticed the luxury surrounding her as waves of transformation continued building in intensity. "What should I expect?" she asked, her voice tight with effort, as her body prepared for changes 8 years in the making. "How long does first shift usually last?" "Anywhere from 20 minutes to several hours, depending on how much resistance the conscious mind offers to the process." Ronan settled beside her on the bed, his presence creating an anchor of stability in the chaos of her emergence. "The most important thing is not to fight what's happening. Let your wolf consciousness take control and guide the transformation." "But I don't know how to shift. I don't know what it feels like or how to manage the process." "Your wolf does. Trust her to know what she's doing." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with surprising tenderness given the intensity of what was happening. "And trust me to help you through whatever complications arise." The next wave hit her with the force of a physical blow, accompanied by sensations that made her cry out with a mixture of pain and exhilaration. Her bones were definitely shifting now, not breaking, but elongating and reshaping themselves with organic fluidity that should have been impossible. Her senses continued sharpening, until the room became a symphony of details she'd never noticed before, and her awareness of Ronan's presence intensified, until she could feel his emotions as clearly as her own. "I can feel what you're feeling," she gasped, staring at him with wonder despite the chaos happening in her body. "Your wolf is excited, protective, something else I can't identify." "Possessive," he said quietly. "My wolf is intensely possessive of you right now. It's taking all my self-control not to claim you completely while your defenses are lowered by the transformation." The admission sent heat flooding through her system that had nothing to do with the emergence process and everything to do with the way he was looking at her, like she was something precious that he'd been searching for his entire life. "Claim me how?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "The way wolves claim their mates. Through bite, through scent, through physical bonding that creates connections that can't be severed by time or distance." His thumb traced across her knuckles with careful restraint. "But not while you're in the middle of emergence. Not while you can't give truly informed consent to bonds that will reshape both our lives." The consideration he was showing for her emotional state, even while his own wolf was clearly demanding immediate claiming, made something in her chest warm with affection that went deeper than physical attraction. "What if I want to be claimed?" she asked softly. "What if my wolf is asking for bonds that my human mind is too inexperienced to understand?" The question seemed to hit him like a physical blow. His breathing became more labored, and she could feel his struggle to maintain control through whatever connection was developing between them. "Then we'll explore those bonds when your emergence is complete, and you can evaluate what you're asking for with full awareness of the implications," he said, his voice strained with the effort of restraint. "Alara, you have no idea how much I want to give you everything your wolf is asking for, but I won't take advantage of emergence vulnerability to secure bonds you might regret once you're thinking clearly." The protective consideration in his response made her fall a little more in love with him, even as her emerging wolf pressed for immediate satisfaction of instincts that demanded claiming and possession. Another wave of transformation swept through her, stronger than before, and this time she felt her body beginning the actual process of shift. Her spine arched as bone structure changed, muscles elongated, and her nervous system rewired itself to accommodate dual consciousness. The sensation was overwhelming, not painful exactly, but so intense that rational thought became impossible. "Let go," Ronan said, his voice seeming to reach her from a great distance. "Stop fighting the process and let your wolf take control." So she did. She released her grip on human consciousness and allowed herself to sink into awareness that felt ancient, primal, and utterly natural despite being completely foreign. Her wolf consciousness rose to meet the transformation, guiding changes that human understanding couldn't manage alone. When the shift finally completed, Alara found herself looking at the world through eyes that processed information differently, hearing sounds her human ears couldn't detect, and experiencing Ronan's presence through senses that made their connection feel like a physical thing binding them together. Her wolf was smaller than she'd expected, not the massive predator she'd imagined, but a lean, graceful creature with silver-gray fur and intelligent amber eyes that seemed to mirror Ronan's own. She felt powerful, free, and for the first time in her life, complete. "Beautiful," Ronan's voice said, though his lips didn't move. "She's absolutely beautiful." The communication was happening through their developing mate bond, she realized. Direct transfer of thought and emotion that made spoken language unnecessary. "Is this what it feels like to be whole?" she asked, marveling at the ease with which the mental conversation flowed between them. "This is what it feels like to find your other half," he replied, his wolf consciousness reaching out to wrap around hers with protective tenderness. "Welcome to your true nature, Alara." As they lay together on the large bed, he in human form, she exploring her new wolf body, Alara felt peace settle over her in ways she'd never experienced. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible, wasn't defective, wasn't something to be tolerated through obligation. She was a wolf, bonded to a mate whose consciousness felt like coming home, carrying abilities she was only beginning to understand. The emergence had been everything Dr. Voss had warned about: overwhelming, intense, and transformative in ways that went far beyond physical change. But it had also been exactly what she'd never dared to hope for: the discovery that she wasn't broken, just delayed, and that her wolf had been waiting for the right moment and the right mate to finally reveal herself. As evening fell over the stronghold, and her wolf consciousness settled into peaceful contentment beside her mate, Alara realized that her life as an invisible Omega outcast had ended forever. What would replace it remained to be seen, but for the first time in her 22 years, the unknown felt like promise rather than threat, because she was no longer facing that unknown alone. She had a wolf, she had a mate, and she had power she was only beginning to understand. The question was what she would do with all three. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the royal wing, as Alara stood before a mirror that reflected someone she barely recognized. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the invisible Omega who had sat alone in dining hall corners just half a year ago. Her silver-gray hair now caught the light with an inner luminescence that spoke of wolf vitality. Her amber eyes held depths of confidence she'd never possessed as a human, and her bearing radiated the quiet strength of someone who had finally found her place in the world. But it was the mark on her throat that transformed her most completely. Ronan's claiming bite, healed into a silver scar that proclaimed her status as future Luna to anyone who cared to look. The bonding ceremony had taken place 3 months after her emergence. Once her wolf had fully integrated, and she could make informed decisions about bonds that would last a lifetime. "Still getting used to seeing her?" Ronan asked, emerging from their shared bathroom with the casual intimacy of someone who had earned the right to every corner of her life. 6 months of living together, of learning to navigate both human and wolf consciousness, of discovering what it meant to be bound to someone whose soul matched hers in ways that transcended rational understanding. "Sometimes I look in the mirror and expect to see the old me," she admitted, turning away from her reflection to face the man who had become her anchor in a world that still felt new and overwhelming. The invisible girl who sat alone and hoped nobody would notice her. "That girl was never invisible to the people who mattered," Ronan said, moving to stand behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders with the possessive tenderness that had become as natural as breathing. She was just waiting for the right moment to let herself be seen. Through the windows of their quarters, the sounds of the stronghold waking drifted upward. Conversations in the courtyards, training sessions beginning in the practice yards, the 1,000 small activities that made up daily life in a community of 3,000 wolves. But now those sounds felt like belonging rather than exclusion, like being part of something larger rather than watching it from the margins. "The Pack Council meeting is this afternoon," Alara said, leaning back against Ronan's solid warmth as nervous energy fluttered through her system. "Are you certain I'm ready for this?" "You're ready," he assured her, his lips brushing against the mark on her throat with casual possession that still made her breath catch. "You've been ready since the moment you chose to trust your wolf enough to let her emerge." The Pack Council meeting would be her formal introduction as future Luna, the first time she'd stand before the assembled leadership and accept responsibility for helping guide their people's future. It should have been terrifying, the idea of going from Omega outcast to royal authority in the span of 6 months. Instead, it felt like finally stepping into a role she'd been preparing for her entire life without realizing it. Lydia requested a private audience before the meeting, Ronan mentioned, his tone carefully neutral as he spoke of his former intended mate. I told her that anything she needs to say can be said in front of both of us. The relationship between Alara and Lydia had been complex. The woman who had been destined to become Luna before Alara's emergence had handled the disruption of her life plans with grace that spoke of genuine strength, but there was no mistaking the loss she'd suffered or the adjustment period that had followed. She's been fair about the situation, Alara said diplomatically, more fair than I probably would have been if our positions had been reversed. She recognizes true mate bonds when she sees them, and she's smart enough to understand that fighting against genetic compatibility would have destroyed everyone involved. Ronan's arms tightened around her slightly. But I'm glad you two have found a way to coexist peacefully. The pack functions better when there's harmony among the leadership. A soft knock at their door interrupted the conversation, followed by the voice of Matthias, calling for permission to enter. Even 6 months later, Alara still felt a flutter of intimidation when dealing with the Alpha King, though he'd been nothing but supportive of her integration into the royal family. Come in, Ronan called, and Matthias entered carrying the kind of formal documents that suggested official business rather than casual family conversation. Good morning, the Alpha King said, his amber eyes holding warmth as they settled on Alara. I hope you're both prepared for this afternoon's formal proceedings. As prepared as we can be, Alara replied, though her voice carried the uncertainty that still plagued her when contemplating the scope of responsibility she was about to accept. Though I have to admit, the idea of addressing the entire Pack Council still makes me nervous. Nervousness is appropriate. Overconfidence in leadership positions leads to poor decisions and dangerous outcomes. Matthias settled into one of the sitting room chairs with the fluid grace that marked all the males in the royal bloodline. But I wanted to discuss something with both of you before the formal ceremonies begin. The seriousness in his tone immediately put them both on alert. What kind of something? Ronan asked, his body language shifting subtly into protective mode. Intelligence reports from our border territories suggest that other packs have taken notice of the unusual circumstances surrounding your mate bond, Matthias said carefully. There's speculation about Alara's delayed emergence, questions about whether late-blooming wolves might possess abilities that standard emergence doesn't develop. What kind of abilities? Alara asked, though part of her already suspected where this conversation was heading. Enhanced empathy, stronger mate bonds, unusual resistance to standard pack hierarchies. Matthias's expression grew more serious. There are rumors that late-emerging wolves might be capable of cross-pack communication, of bonds that transcend traditional territorial boundaries. The implications hit Alara like cold water. If other packs believed she possessed abilities that could disrupt traditional pack structure, she wasn't just future Luna of the Dravic territory. She was a potential threat to the established order that kept the various wolf populations from open warfare. Are the rumors true? She asked quietly. Do I have abilities that extend beyond normal wolf capabilities? We don't know yet, Matthias admitted. Your emergence was so recent that we're still discovering the full scope of your capabilities. But the fact that other packs are asking questions suggests we need to be prepared for increased scrutiny of your role here. Increased scrutiny meaning what exactly? Ronan's voice carried the protective edge that emerged whenever he sensed threats to their bond. Meaning that your mate bond may become a political issue that extends far beyond our territory, Matthias replied bluntly. If other packs decide that Alara represents a threat to pack stability, they may attempt to neutralize that threat through diplomatic pressure or direct action. The casual mention of direct action sent ice through Alara's system. She'd spent 6 months learning to navigate the complexities of being mated to pack royalty, but she was still adjusting to the idea that her personal relationships could become matters of international political significance. What do you recommend? She asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear flooding her system. I recommend that you embrace your role as future Luna with confidence and demonstrate that your abilities serve to strengthen pack bonds rather than disrupt them, Matthias said, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had navigated political threats for decades. Show them that late emergence creates wolves who are more committed to pack welfare, not less. And if that's not enough to satisfy their concerns, then we deal with those challenges as they arise. His smile was sharp with predatory satisfaction. But I have confidence in your ability to prove that their concerns are unfounded. As Matthias departed to continue preparations for the afternoon ceremony, Alara found herself standing at the window, looking out over the territory that would soon be partially her responsibility to protect. 6 months ago, Her biggest concern had been avoiding attention during mealtimes. Now she was apparently a person whose very existence could reshape the balance of power among the northern packs. Regrets? Ronan asked, moving to stand beside her at the window. About which part? Discovering I have a wolf, accepting a mate bond, or becoming a potential target for international political intrigue? About any of it, all of it. His amber eyes searched her face with intensity that still made her pulse quicken. If you could go back to being invisible, unimportant, safe in your anonymity, would you choose that over what we have now? The question deserved honest consideration. Her life had certainly been simpler when she'd been nobody special, when her biggest decisions involved which corner of the dining hall would attract the least attention. But simplicity wasn't the same thing as fulfillment, and safety wasn't the same thing as happiness. No, she said finally, her voice carrying conviction that surprised her with its strength. No regrets. Whatever challenges come from being mated to you, from having abilities that complicate pack politics, from being responsible for people's welfare, it's all better than spending the rest of my life wondering what I might have been if I'd been brave enough to find out. Good, he said, pulling her into his arms with the possessive tenderness that had become as essential as breathing. Because I have no intention of letting you go, regardless of what political complications arise from our bond. As afternoon approached, and the time came for Alara to step into her role as future Luna, she felt peace settle over her in ways that had nothing to do with the absence of problems, and everything to do with the presence of someone whose love made any challenge seem manageable. She was no longer invisible, no longer unimportant, no longer safe in anonymity. She was a wolf, a mate, a future leader whose very existence might reshape the foundations of pack society. But most importantly, she was exactly who she was meant to be, and that, she thought, as Ronan's arms tightened around her, was worth any price the future might demand. The invisible girl who had sat alone in dining hall corners was gone forever. In her place stood someone ready to face whatever came next, with the confidence that came from finally understanding her true nature. And if the world found that transformation threatening, then the world would simply have to adjust. Because Alara Voss, future Luna of the Dravik Pack, late emerging wolf, and mate to the heir of the Northern Territories, had no intention of making herself small ever again. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.